I've been collecting Yiddish songs of the East End, mainly of the East End, and they're absolutely fascinating because these are Yiddish songs that people might have sung on the street, they might have skipped to, it might have been children's songs, and they bring up all sorts of like nuggets in tiny crevices of social histories of the East End. So they're songs that mention places and people and events, and characters like Old Solomon Levy, or places like Morgan Street or Wentworth Street and the Pavilion Theatre, and they all come up in these songs, and it's unusual because there are thousands of Yiddish songs, and most of them are songs of the Heim, of Eastern Europe, and some of them are the songs of Die Goldene Medina, America, but we've got our own English, Anglo-Yiddish songs, and I think that that's terrifically exciting. And some of the tunes are fabulous, some of the tunes are frightfully stupid, but the words are just very precious because the words are gems of social history, and it tells us an awful lot about what things were happening at the time in the East End, and it tells us a lot about life and about how people were, and I mean it's a question as to who sung these songs and where they're from and who knew them and so on. So one of the themes that comes up in the songs, in particular, it's very interesting, and it comes up in two different ways, is the theme of Jewish prostitution. And it comes up, firstly, there's a very interesting song by Morris Winchevsky. Now, Morris Winchevsky was born in the Heim, in Eastern Europe, and he came over to England on his way to America, and he saw what was happening. And he described what he saw. Now, he was a very political poet and activist, and he wrote... he was called one of the sweatshop poets, and so he became famous. He actually died quite young, but he was a very, very interesting poet, and a number of his poems have been put to music. And this one is about London. Now, essentially, it's about the West End. It's about three girls who work in the West End, but they probably live in the East End. And shall I tell you a bit about the story of them? So the song is about three sisters. The youngest sells flowers, the oldest one sells shoelaces, and the oldest sells herself. And the three sisters, the two younger sisters, don't hate the older sister for what she does. They hate die Welt, the world, and die Stadt, the town, and die Gas, the street. And late at night, when they come home, the shoelaces and the flowers are drenched with their tears. And it's a really interesting song because it's about prostitutes, and it's written in Yiddish, and clearly it's about Yiddish prostitutes. And obviously he's writing in maybe the mid-1880s and 1890s, and it was a subject that was known about. There were Jewish prostitutes in the East End, and the East End was very rife with prostitutes generally in the culture, but there were Jewish girls as well. And although the Jewish community was embarrassed at the situation of the poverty, not just the prostitutes, but was very sort of like embarrassed about the concept of Jewish prostitutes, there were organizations like the Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women who were really fighting for women and were wanting to bring this up. And the reason is that because there was movement of Jews coming from Eastern Europe and across to here and to America and to other places, it was the criminal elements of society had this complete network set up to do stuff. So the establishment, or the established white slave trade that was happening with taking girls from places to other places and selling them to brothels, Jewish men, Jewish criminals, Jewish pimps were taking that on as well. And they were going to Poland and they were sort of like duping women or seducing women, or all sorts of ways, women wanting to get out of poverty and wanting to get out of the sort of the terrible life that was happening in Russia and Poland, in Galicia in particular, and to take them out to other places, via Britain often, then to Argentina or to America and other places in South America and South Africa. And so there is a horrible history, and this organisation, the Jewish Society for the Protection of Girls and Women, they went down to the dockside and they were allowed to go onto the boats before they disembarked and go and find women travelling with single men who weren't their family or alone, and to make sure that they knew where they were going and really try and protect them. And they also really publicised it. They went out, they put adverts in papers in Eastern Europe to say, do not let your girls go off with strangers you don't know. And they also really publicised it here. So people were very concerned. And obviously it's not huge numbers, but it was numbers enough to be really concerning to the Jewish community. In England is du a Stadt Leicester, in London is du as a Square, zum Square kommen täglich 3 Schwester, 3 Meidler, wer weiß sei nicht wer, die Jüngste verkauft dorten Blumen, die Ältere bändlicht sie schier, in spät in der Nacht tit sie kommen, die Dritte, wo's handelt mit sich, die jüngere Schwester betrachten, die ältere Schwester und Hass, nur alle 3 Schwester verraten, die Welt in die Stutt, in die Gas, es brechen sich goldene Sangen, es drückt sei der Sturm zieht raut, es wären die beste Verlangen, auf versöhnigen Tug euch zerstellt, in spät in der Nacht, wenn sei kämen, zum Nest, wo sei riefen es heim, vergießen sei bändlich in Blumen, mit Tränen, wo's willen nicht vergehen. In England ist du a Stadt Leicester, in London ist du as a Square, zum Square kommen täglich 3 Schwester, 3 Meidler, wer weiß sei nicht wer. It's interesting where you learn Yiddish songs from, and I learnt this song during Klesfest one summer, which is a summer course in London, from a man called Carsten Troika. Now, Carsten Troika is a German, non-Jewish Yiddish folk singer. And I asked him, what's a German boy like you singing a Yiddish song about London? And he said, well, that's a very interesting question. I learnt it from an Argentinian actress. And he asked her, why are you singing a song about London? And she said, well, that's a very interesting question. I was given this song by Helene Weigel. Now, it might not mean something to you, that name, but Helene Weigel was the widow of Bertolt Brecht. And Weigel said, Brecht loved this song because the characters in it, the sisters, don't blame each other. They blame society. And so I think it's a really powerful political song. There are other songs that mention prostitution that are East End Yiddish songs as well, but they mention it in a completely different way. They don't mention it politically, and they don't mention it with the sort of concepts of poverty and sadness and white slave trade and anger. They don't come out of that sphere, which was the reality of what prostitution was, or a part of it. But it is also mentioned as very much as a nudge, nudge, wink, wink type of humour. They come up, and it comes up in other songs. There's a song called Victoria Park. And there's a line in Victoria Park that talks about Chaita from Lita, from Lithuania. She is die Dritte, she's the third. Sie wohnt in city. She lives in the city. Now, living in the city was actually really, really uncommon. You wouldn't live in the city. You might have lived in the West End in Soho as a poor Jew. You might have lived in, or as a rich Jew for that matter. You might have lived in the East End, but living in the city is clearly saying something else. And so you have to have a think about what that something else is. Now, Victoria Park is a song that was collected by Derek Reed, and it was collected from a woman called Bertha Jackson. And Bertha Jackson lived in Liverpool, and she heard this song from her uncle, who was a travelling salesman, who went up to Liverpool. He must have picked it up in London and sang it to her in Liverpool. And she was absolutely sure, Derek told me, that Bertha was sure that sie wohnt in the city, she lived in the city, nudge, nudge, meant that she was a prostitute. So it's very interesting, and the rest of Victoria Park is about who's in Victoria Park. There's this one, the porter with a fat neck, and Fanny, who was all got spots on her face, and Reuter Benny, red-headed Benny, and Grobe Annie, Fatty Annie, and so on. It mentions all these characters, and it mentions people running around looking for jobs, and it mentions this prostitute as well. So clearly that people like prostitutes became established parts of the sort of the Jewish world and the way that who was living in the East End at the time, parts of the Jewish community.